before we settle in for this evening's account. If you find meaning in these explorations of the unknown, I invite you to subscribe and share your support. It allows us to keep uncovering these hidden histories. I am also curious where you are listening from tonight. Please leave a note in the comments. Now, let us begin. I will never forget the specific hue of the light that emanated from beneath the ice. It was not the pale, crystalline blue one might anticipate on a February morning on a Minnesota lake. It was something else entirely, a distinct variation that fell out of place in the natural order. It was a sickly yellow-green, pulsated with a rhythm that resembled a slow, deep heartbeat, clearly visible even through 3 feet of solid, frozen water. Jim Kowalski's fishing hole remained open, steam rising from the dark water like a shallow breath in the frigid air. His tackle box sat beside it, perfectly organized, every lure and line in its designated place. His thermos was still warm to the touch. But Jim himself was gone, and something down there in the frozen deep was aware of our presence. My name is Thomas Morrison, though everyone in this region simply calls me Tom. I have served as the sheriff of St. Louis County, Minnesota, for 22 years. The Iron Range is my home, and it has been my entire life. My grandfather held this office before me, and his father before him. 3 generations of Morrisons dedicated to maintaining the peace in this quiet, often forgotten corner of northern Minnesota, where the winters are formidable and the land seems to hold memories that its inhabitants often try to overlook. February of 1984 was one of the coldest periods on record. We were experiencing temperatures dropping to 30 or 40 degrees below zero, exacerbated by a wind chill that could freeze the very air in your lungs. It was a kind of cold that demands respect, the kind that reshapes your daily existence. Most sensible people remained indoors, tending to their fires and waiting for the eventual arrival of spring. But this is Minnesota. We do not cease living simply because the temperature drops. Ice fishing is a tradition here, a way of life that has persisted for generations. The call came in at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning. My dispatcher, Betty Hansen, sounded concerned, which was unusual for her, as Betty was a woman of great composure. She informed me that we had a developing situation out on Vermilion Lake. Jim Kowalski had not returned home from his fishing trip the previous day. His wife, Carol, had found his truck at the public access point. The engine was still running, and the heater was blasting at full capacity. She had driven out there when he failed to return by midnight. I knew Jim well. Everyone in the town of Tower knew Jim. He was 53 years old, a retired miner from the old Sudan mine, who had been ice fishing on Vermilion Lake since he was a boy. The man understood the lake intimately, knowing its currents and its depths as well as he knew his own backyard. He was not the type to wander aimlessly or make careless errors on thin ice. Something about this report felt unsettling. I reached for my heavy parka, the one bearing the department patch on the shoulder, and stepped out into the pre-dawn darkness. The sun would not rise for another hour, and the thermometer on my office wall read -32 degrees. My deputy, Mike Carlson, met me at the station. Mike was 35, a man of significant strength and a third-generation Finnish American. He was a good man, steady and reliable. We took my Bronco out to the lake. The roads were challenging, packed with snow and slick with ice. The wind howled around the vehicle, creating whiteout conditions that made it difficult to see more than 20 feet ahead. We passed through Tower, the small mining town where Jim lived, a community of 800 souls where everyone is connected. Lights were visible in a few windows despite the early hour. It felt as though the town itself was watching, waiting for news. In small towns, information travels swiftly, often faster than the wind itself. The public access point was situated about 3 miles south of town. We located Jim's truck just as Betty had described. It was a 1978 Ford, the engine still humming quietly, its headlights cutting a twin path through the blowing snow. The driver's side door was closed but unlocked. I pulled up beside it and turned off my engine. Mike and I sat there for a moment in the sudden silence. neither of us eager to step out into the biting atmosphere. Mike asked if I was ready, adjusting his balaclava. I replied that I was, though a sense of hesitation lingered. We exited the vehicle. The cold hit us immediately, a physical weight that seemed to press against us. The wind screamed across the frozen expanse of the lake, picking up loose snow and casting it around us like dust. I walked over to Jim's truck and peered inside. His wallet rested on the passenger seat. His glasses were folded neatly on the dashboard. Jim required those glasses to see anything clearly beyond a few feet. He would never have left them behind willingly. Mike was already venturing out onto the ice, the beam of his flashlight cutting a slender path through the gloom. I followed, my boots crunching rhythmically on the wind-scoured surface. The ice on Vermilion Lake was solid, at least 3 feet thick, as secure as concrete. Yet I could not shake a feeling profound unease that seemed to travel up my spine with every step I took. We located his spot about 200 yards from the shore. Jim had set up his ice house, a small wooden shelter on runners designed to be dragged across the ice. The door was firmly closed. Mike reached it first and knocked, his knuckles rapping sharply against the wood. There was no answer. He pulled the door open, and we both looked inside. It was empty. A small propane heater was still functioning, keeping the interior surprisingly comfortable. A folding chair sat beside the fishing hole, which, to our astonishment, was still open. Dark water was visible within the circle of ice. Jim's fishing rod was propped against the wall, the line trailing into the water. Everything was neat, orderly, exactly the way Jim would have maintained it, except Jim was not there. Mike knelt beside the fishing hole and called for my attention. I crouched down next to him, and that was when I saw it clearly for the first time. The light was emanating from deep below the surface. It was a strange yellow-green glow that pulsed slowly, like the respiration of a living thing. The water in the hole was perfectly still. There was no movement, no current, no ripple. It was akin to gazing into a pool of dark glass. Mike whispered, asking what it could possibly be. I admitted I did not know. He suggested it might be some form of algae or bioluminescence, though finding such a thing in February under 3 feet of ice seemed scientifically improbable. He had a valid point. I had grown up on these lakes and had never witnessed a phenomenon like this. I reached into my pocket and retrieved a small flashlight, shining it down into the hole. The beam barely penetrated the murk. The water seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Mike suggested we call for the dive team, but I hesitated. Sending divers into water at this temperature was incredibly risky. It was near freezing down there. I sat back on my heels, contemplating our options. The rational part of my mind insisted there must be a logical explanation. Perhaps Jim had wandered off, become disoriented in the dark, or slipped somewhere else. The light could be a natural gas vent or a reflection we didn't understand. But another part of my mind, the part that recalled the stories my grandfather told, was less certain. Sheriff Jonas Morrison had passed away when I was 15, but before he left us, he shared stories about the Iron Range. He spoke of the old mining days and of occurrences in the deep places beneath the earth, events that never made it into the official reports. I had always dismissed them as folklore, the kind of tales old men tell to pass the time. Now, kneeling on the ice in the pre-dawn gray, I was not so sure. We decided to search the immediate area for tracks or any sign of where Jim might have gone. We spent the next hour combing the ice around the fishing spot. The wind had scoured away most of the loose snow, making tracking difficult. But we moved with diligence, looking for any clue in the frozen landscape. We continued our search, the wind biting at our exposed skin, moving in widening arcs around the empty ice house. The landscape was monotonous, a flat sheet of white stretching into the darkness, broken only by the occasional drift of snow. But then Mike found something about 50 yards to the east. He called out to me, his voice carrying a note of sharp discovery over the wind. I made my way over to where he stood. There were more fishing holes, 6 of them, to be precise, arranged in a perfect circle. Each one was spaced exactly 10 feet from the next. These were older holes, frozen over with a thin layer of new ice, but the circular cuts were still clearly visible against the surrounding white. Mike pointed out the pattern, his voice tight with confusion. I looked closer and realized he was correct. The holes formed a flawless circle, and in the exact center of that geometric arrangement was Jim's fishing spot. Someone had drilled these holes deliberately. They had arranged them in a specific pattern, with a precision that felt almost mathematical. But the question remained, why and when? I knelt and brushed the snow away from one of the frozen holes. The ice was clear enough that I could peer down into the depths, and there, in the dark water below, was that same yellow-green light. It was fainter than it had been in Jim's open hole, but it was undeniably present. All 6 holes possessed it. Mike moved from hole to hole, kneeling at each one to confirm. He reported that every single one contained the glow. It was a baffling discovery. Before I could formulate a theory, we heard it. A sound began to emanate from beneath the ice. It was low and deep, reminiscent of heavy machinery operating far below the surface. But there was no machinery out here. There were no boats, no mining equipment, nothing but the silent lake. The sound grew louder, resonating through the ice beneath our feet. I could feel the vibration traveling up through my boots and into my chest. Mike suggested we get off the ice, stepping backward toward the shore. I held up my hand, urging him to wait a moment. The sound shifted. It changed from a mechanical hum into something almost musical. It was not mechanical at all. It was more like singing, if singing could be performed by something that did not possess a human voice. It was a resonant, multi-tonal vibration that seemed to bypass the ears and hum directly in the bones. The yellow-green light in the holes began to pulse faster, growing brighter with the intensity of the sound. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it extinguished. All of it went out at once. Complete darkness returned to the depths, leaving only the beams of our flashlights cutting through the gray morning. Then the ice beneath us groaned. It was a long, creaking sound, the kind of noise a massive structure makes when it settles. It made my stomach drop, but it wasn't cracking. The ice remained solid. The sound was something else, something deeper, as if the lake itself was shifting in its sleep. I knew then that we needed to leave. We began to move, our pace quickening into an urgent retreat. We made it back to the shore in record time, our boots pounding a frantic rhythm on the ice. We did not stop until we reached the trucks. Mike was breathing hard, his face pale in the growing dawn light. I was not faring much better. My hands were trembling, and I knew it wasn't solely from the cold. Mike asked me what that was, his voice shaking. I told him truthfully that I didn't know, but we were going to find out. We drove back to tower as the sun finally crested the horizon, turning the sky a pale, washed-out gray. I dropped Mike off at the station and instructed him to start making calls. We needed a search party. We needed to organize a proper grid search of the lake to be thorough. But first, I needed to make a stop. The Tower Historical Society was located in an old brick building on Main Street, right next to the Lutheran Church. The Society's curator, Margaret Sanderson, was already there when I arrived, even though it was barely 8 in the morning. Margaret was 76 years old, a woman of sharp intellect who knew more about Iron Range history than anyone alive. She looked up as I walked in, stomping the snow off my boots. She commented that I looked as though I had seen a ghost. I told her that perhaps I had. I explained that I needed to examine some old records, specifically anything related to Vermilion Lake. I was looking for missing persons reports, accidents, or unusual events, going back as far as her archives would allow. She studied me for a long moment, her eyes assessing my demeanor, then she nodded. She led me to the archives in the basement, a cramped room filled with filing cabinets and boxes of old newspapers that smelled of dust and time. Margaret pulled out a large leather-bound book and laid it on the table. She told me these were the sheriff's reports, dating back to 1900. They were my great-grandfather's records. I opened the book and began to read. It did not take long to find what I was looking for. February 1904. The entry detailed 3 miners who disappeared while ice fishing on Vermilion Lake. Their gear was found, but their bodies were never recovered. The report described strange lights seen beneath the ice in the days leading up to the disappearances. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the basement temperature. I flipped forward in the book. February 1944. 5 men missing on Vermilion Lake. The circumstances were identical. Fishing gear found. Bodies missing. Strange lights reported. The investigating officer listed was Sheriff Jonas Morrison, my grandfather. There was a note paperclip to the report, written in my grandfather's distinctive handwriting. It read, "The ice took them just like it did in '04, just like it will do again. The cycle is 40 years. God help whoever is sheriff in 1984. I stared at those words. 1984, that was now. That was this year. I asked Margaret slowly if my grandfather had ever spoken to her about this. She nodded, her expression grim. She recalled that he came to her in 1960, asking about old mining records, specifically about the Soudan mine. He wanted to know if there were tunnels that ran under Vermilion Lake. She told him there were rumors, but nothing official. The mine maps only showed tunnels going down vertically, not extending out horizontally. But the old Finnish miners, the ones who worked there in the 20s and 30s, used to tell stories about finding natural caves deep underground, caves filled with water, underground lakes. I repeated the phrase, underground lakes beneath Vermilion Lake. Margaret leaned forward, her voice lowering. She told me there was something else. The Ojibwe people had stories about Vermilion Lake. 2. Old stories going back centuries. They spoke of something that resides in the deep places beneath the ice. Something that sleeps for long periods but awakens when the cycle turns. They had a name for it, but the word is lost to time now. I felt the atmosphere in the room shift, a heaviness settling over us. I asked if my grandfather believed these stories. She nodded. By the end of his life, yes. He spent his final years trying to uncover the truth of what happened in 1944, but he passed away before he could complete his investigation. They found him at his desk with these very files spread out before him. She walked over to a filing cabinet and retrieved a folder. She told me these were his personal notes. She had kept them after he died, thinking that perhaps someday someone would want to finish what he started. She handed me the folder, telling me she believed that someone was me. I took the folder. Inside were dozens of pages covered in my grandfather's neat handwriting. There were maps of the lake cross-referenced with old mine maps. There were interviews with survivors from 1904. There were drawings of symbols found in the deep tunnels of the Soudan mine. And there were photographs. Old, yellowed photographs showing the same thing I had seen that morning. The yellow-green light beneath the ice. The last page was a letter addressed to whoever came after him, to the next Morrison sheriff. I read it standing there in that quiet basement, and with every word, the sense of responsibility and foreboding grew deeper. The letter stated that if I was reading this, the 40-year cycle had returned. It warned that stopping it required going down into the deep places, into the old Soudan mine, level 27. There was a tunnel there not on any map. He had found it in 1944. He had sealed it, but he knew it would not hold forever. When it woke again in 1984, the duty would fall to the sheriff of that time. He apologized for not being there to help, but reminded me that the Morrisons have always protected this county. The letter urged me to find a tunnel, to discover what lay beneath, and implored me not to go alone. I looked up at Margaret. The Soudan mine had been closed since 1962. However, she informed me there was still a maintenance entrance. The Minnesota Historical Society kept it open for tours during the summer, but in winter it was locked tight. I mentioned getting a warrant, but she shook her head. She volunteered there. She had the keys. 2 hours later, Margaret, Mike, and I stood at the entrance to the Soudan mine. It was carved into the side of a rocky hill, one of the richest iron ore mines in Minnesota history. At its deepest point, level 27, it descended 2,400 feet, half a mile into the earth. Margaret unlocked the heavy steel door. It swung open with a groan of rusted hinges, revealing a concrete tunnel lit by dim emergency lights. The temperature rose as we walked deeper, insulated by the earth. After the brutal cold outside, the consistent 50 degrees felt profound. We entered the industrial cage of the elevator. Margaret operated the controls, and we began our descent. Down and down we went, passing level markers. Level 5, Level 10, Level 15. The elevator swayed gently, a reminder of the immense weight of rock above us. When we reached level 27, the elevator came to a halt. We stepped out into a vast chamber. The walls rough-hewn rock stained rust-red from the iron ore. The air was thick and heavy with the scent of minerals and time. This was where the journey truly began. We stepped out of the elevator cage and onto the uneven floor of level 27. The silence down here was profound, a heavy, tangible presence that seemed to press against our eardrums. It was not merely the absence of sound. It was the weight of the earth itself, the crushing reality of thousands of feet of rock suspended above our heads. The air was thick, carrying a metallic scent, the smell of oxidized iron and ancient dust that had settled over decades of stillness. Margaret led the way, her flashlight beam cutting a cone of illumination through the gloom. The light danced across the walls, revealing rock that was rough and stained a deep rust red. These were the veins of the earth, the very reason this town existed, now left to the quiet dark. Old rail tracks ran along the floor, rusting remnants of an industry that had once bustled with noise and life, now disappearing into the shadows of tunnels that branched off in multiple directions like the roots of a great, petrified tree. Margaret did not hesitate. She navigated these subterranean passages with certainty that spoke of years of study. We walked for what felt like 10 minutes, our boots scuffing against the stone floor, the sound echoing strangely in confined space. We passed abandoned mining carts and tools left where they had been dropped 20 years prior, frozen in time like statues in a museum of industry. The atmosphere was heavy, a humidity that felt almost tropical compared to the biting freeze of the surface world. Finally, Margaret stopped. She pointed her light toward what appeared, at first glance, to be a solid wall of rock. But as we drew closer, the discrepancy became clear. It was a patch of concrete, poured to fill a gap in the natural stone formation. Someone had made a concerted effort to blend it with the surrounding geology, to mask its presence. But to the searching eye, it was an undeniable anomaly. It stood as a barrier, a deliberate seal placed against the unknown. I knelt to examine the surface. The concrete was cold to the touch and slick, with a fine layer of moisture. It felt different than the surrounding rock. Artificial, imposed. Mike leaned in, his breath hitching slightly as he realized what we were looking at. This was a location my grandfather had mentioned in his notes. This was a seal he had placed in 1944. I ran my gloved hand across the rough surface, feeling the texture of the barrier. It was a physical manifestation of a decision made 40 years ago, a decision to close a door on something that could not be understood. Margaret explained, her voice soft in the echoing tunnel, that while the mine maps were extensive, they were incomplete. The miners who had worked these depths in the early 20th century had often encountered natural fissures, openings that led into cave systems that predated the mine by millennia. If this tunnel connected to those natural formations, and if those caves linked to the water table, then the underground geography was far more vast than any map could depict. Mike voiced a concern that was forming in all of our minds. If the system was interconnected, then the entity, whatever phenomenon we were tracking, was not confined to a single location. It had access to the deep roots of the world. We realized then that we could not proceed further without proper equipment. To breach this seal would require tools we did not have, and to explore what lay beyond would require a level of preparation we had not yet undertaken. We were standing on the threshold of a journey that required more than just curiosity. It required a plan. I told them we would return the following day. We needed to be ready. We turned back toward the elevator, the walk seeming longer on a return trip. The anticipation that had driven us down was now replaced by a sober realization of the magnitude of our task. When we emerged from the mine, the transition was jarring. We stepped out of the humid, constant earth into the biting reality of the late afternoon. The sun was already setting, casting long, pale shadows across the snow, and the temperature had dropped even further. The air felt thin and sharp in our lungs. I needed to check on the search efforts. I dropped Mike and Margaret off and headed to the station. The news was as I had feared. The search party had covered the entire south end of Vermilion Lake and found nothing. There were no tracks, no signs of struggle, and no indication of where Jim Kowalski might have gone. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist, vanished into the white landscape. That night, solitude felt particularly heavy. I sat in my home office, the house quiet around me. Outside, the wind had picked up again, howling against the eaves, a constant reminder of the formidable winter that held us in its grip. I read and reread my grandfather's notes, tracing the lines of his handwriting, seeking guidance across the span of 4 decades. I thought about Jim and about his wife, Carol, who was undoubtedly sitting in her own home, waiting for a phone call that I could not yet make. I thought about the cycle, the rhythm of time that seemed to govern these events. The year 1904, the year 1944, and now 1984. It was a pattern, a heartbeat spanning generations. I knew I could not undertake this next step alone. My grandfather's letter had been explicit. Don't go alone. I needed counsel from someone who understood the history of this land far better than I did. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I had not called in years. It rang 4 times before a gravelly voice answered. It was Henry Whitefeather. He was the eldest member of the Ojibwe community near Tower, a man of 89 years who served as a keeper of memories. I told him who I was, though he seemed to already know. I told him I needed to speak about Vermilion Lake and what lay beneath it. There was a pause on the line, a silence that felt heavy with understanding. He asked simply if I had seen the light. When I confirmed that I had, and that a man was missing, he gave me instructions. I was to come to his cabin the next morning, early. There were things I needed to understand before I ventured back into the deep places. I hung up the phone and sat in the darkness, listening to the wind, wondering if I was truly prepared to carry the weight of this legacy. The road to Henry Whitefeather's cabin was a narrow track that wound deep into the forest north of Tower. The pine trees grew thick and tall here, creating a corridor of green and white that blocked out much of the pale winter sky. I arrived just after dawn, the thermometer in my vehicle reading minus 38 degrees. It was a cold that seemed to suspend time, freezing the very air into stillness. Smoke rose from the chimney of Henry's small cabin, a thin gray line ascending straight up into the atmosphere. He was waiting for me on the porch, wrapped in a heavy blanket, his breath clouding in the frigid air. I turned off the engine and stepped out. The silence of the woods was absolute. Henry did not speak immediately. He merely watched me approach with eyes that were dark and unreadable, eyes that had seen nearly a century of winters. He remarked that I resembled my grandfather, noting the same worry lines, the same burden carried on the shoulders. He invited me inside, stating that the cold was no place for the conversation we needed to have. The interior of the cabin was a stark contrast to the world outside. It was intensely warm, heated by a wood stove that glowed with steady, comforting red heat in the center of the single room. The air smelled of wood smoke, dried sage, and strong coffee. The walls were adorned with the history of a life lived in close communion with the land. There were old photographs, hunting tools, and objects that appeared ceremonial, drums, feathers, and stones carved with symbols I did not recognize but instinctively respected. Henry gestured for me to sit at a small wooden table and poured 2 cups of coffee from a battered metal pot. He moved with a slowness that spoke of age, but his hands were steady. He began to speak of 1944. He told me that my grandfather had come to him just after the 5 men had disappeared. Initially, Jonas had been a skeptic, a man of laws and facts who dismissed the old stories as mere superstition. But after he had ascended into the mine, after he had witnessed the unexplained phenomena in the depths, his perspective had shifted fundamentally. He had spent the remainder of his life trying to comprehend the nature of the lake. I asked Henry the question that had been burning in my mind. What was it? What resided down there? The old man took a long, thoughtful sip of his coffee, his gaze drifting to the window and the snow beyond. He explained that his people had many names for it. He said the most common reference point might be the Wendigo, but he clarified that this was not accurate. The Wendigo of legend is a spirit of winter, hunger born of desperation. The entity beneath Vermilion Lake was something else entirely. It was older than the legends, older than his people, older than any human presence on this land. It had been here before the glaciers carved the landscape, and he believed it would remain long after we were gone. He stood up and walked to a wooden chest in the corner of the room. From it, he retrieved a rolled bundle of deer hide, the leather soft and worn with age. He spread it out on the table between us, smoothing the edges with reverence. It was a map drawn in faded ink and charcoal. It depicted Vermilion Lake, but it also showed what lay beneath the surface, a complex network of caves and waterways, a subterranean labyrinth that mirrored the world above. All the tunnels converged on a central chamber, marked with a symbol that resembled a spiral enclosed within a circle. Henry explained that the earth beneath the Iron Range was porous, filled with natural voids that the mining companies had never fully charted. In the deepest places, where the rock met the ancient water, the entity resided. My grandfather had called it the water that hungers. Henry explained that it was not a creature in the biological sense. It was elemental. It possessed a form of consciousness, fluid and ancient. It followed a cycle of dormancy and wakefulness. Every 40 years, when the winter was at its zenith and the ice was at its thickest, it would stir. It sought vitality. It absorbed the essence of those it took, preserving their physical forms in the cold deep while consuming their life force. It was a cycle of energy, a feeding that allowed it to return to its slumber. I stared at the map, trying to reconcile this mythology with the reality of my job as a sheriff. It sounded impossible, yet the evidence, the lights, the missing men, the notes, aligned perfectly. I asked him how we could stop it. Henry shook his head slowly. He told me that my grandfather had asked the same question. The truth, he said, was that he did not know if it could be stopped permanently. It was as much a part of the earth as the iron ore or the bedrock. However, it could be contained. It could be bound. He described what they had done in 1944. Jonas and a group of men had descended into the mine. They had located the central chamber and performed a ceremony of binding, using elements of fire and earth to drive the entity back into the depths, to enforce its dormancy. It had worked for 40 years. But now, the seal was breaking. The influence was leaking through. I understood then what needed to be done. We needed to go down there and renew the binding. I told Henry the First would undertake this task, but he interrupted me. He reminded me of the rule. I could not go alone. The ceremony of binding required balance. It required 4 individuals, representing the 4 cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. My grandfather had help, and I would need it as well. I thought of Mike, my loyal deputy. I thought of Margaret, with her knowledge of the mine. But we would need a 4th. We needed someone of great physical and mental fortitude. I asked Henry if he would join us. He was quiet for a long time. Finally, he nodded. He admitted his body was weak, his bones old, but his spirit was willing. He said this land was his responsibility as much as it was mine. We would protect it together. We spent the next several hours planning. Henry drew another map, detailing the path through the natural caves to the central chamber. He explained the nature of the ritual. It was not a battle, but an assertion of will, a way to restore the boundary between the human world and the deep. I left his cabin with a clear sense of purpose. The sun was fully up, though it offered no warmth. I drove back to town to assemble the team. I spoke to Mike first, pulling him into my office and closing the door. I told him everything: the history, the map, the nature of the threat. I expected disbelief, but Mike simply listened. He revealed that his own grandmother had told him stories of the deep places, tales he had dismissed as fairy tales until now. He pledged his help immediately. We then considered our fourth member. Mike suggested Eric Erickson. Big Eric was a fire chief in Tower, a man of immense stature and calm demeanor. He had worked in the mines in the 50s and was known for his unshakable nerves. If anyone could face the unknown without faltering, it was him. I called Eric to my office. He arrived with snow dusting his shoulders, filling the room with his presence. I laid out the situation. Eric listened without interrupting, his face impassive. When I finished, he leaned back and nodded. He told me he had worked level 27 back in 1958. He had seen things down there, strange formations, water that glowed. The old-timers had told him not to ask questions. He had always wondered what they were hiding. Now he knew. He agreed to join us. We set the time for the following morning. We would need the rest of the day to prepare our supplies and our minds. As I watched them leave my office, I felt a profound sense of camaraderie. We were 4 people from different walks of life, brought together by a duty to protect our community from a threat they would never know existed. The weight was still there, but it was now shared. The remainder of that day passed in a blur of focused activity, a stark contrast to the slow, creeping dread that had characterized the morning. We were no longer reacting to the unknown. We were preparing to meet it. Margaret Sanderson closed the Tower Historical Society early, a rare occurrence that surely raised eyebrows among the regulars. She moved with a quiet efficiency, gathering the specific equipment we would need for descent. She packed industrial flashlights with spare batteries, heavy-duty climbing rope, and basic first aid supplies. But the most crucial item she secured was the master key ring for the Sudan mine, a simple loop of metal that held the power to open doors that had been sealed for a generation. At the station, Mike Carlson and I went through our own preparations. We checked our standard issue gear, though we both silently acknowledged the futility of conventional tools against what we were about to face. It was more about the comfort of ritual, the reassurance of familiar weight on our belts. Mike's face was set in a line of grim determination. He was young, with a life ahead of him, yet he moved with the gravity of a man accepting a burden far older than himself. We spoke little, our communication reduced to nods and brief confirmations. There is a specific kind of silence that falls between people who share a secret of this magnitude, a bond forged not in words, but in the mutual understanding of necessity. Eric Erickson, our fourth, was equally industrious. He utilized his resources at the fire station to assemble a kit that would be vital for survival in the deep earth. He packed thermal blankets, magnesium flares capable of burning in damp conditions, and an old, tempered steel mining pick that had belonged to his father. Eric was a man who understood the language of stone and earth. He knew that below the surface, the environment itself was the first challenge to overcome. His presence brought a sense of solidity to our group. He was a mountain of a man, unshakable and rooted. That evening, as the preparations concluded and the town of Towers settled into the quiet rhythm of a winter night, I went home to my wife, Susan. We had been married for 23 years, building a life together in this harsh, beautiful landscape. We had raised 2 daughters who were now away at college, leaving the house filled with the echoes of their childhood. Susan was a schoolteacher, a woman of immense practicality and a level-headedness that had anchored me through the tumultuous years of my career. In all our time together, I had never kept a significant secret from her. We shared the burdens of life equally. But this was different. How does one explain to the person they love that they are about to descend miles into the earth to confront a legend? I sat at our kitchen table, watching the steam rise from the coffee she had poured for me. The house was warm, a sanctuary against the howling wind outside. I tried to find the words. I told her simply that I had to go into the mine the next day. I told her it was related to the missing men, to Jim Kowalski, and to something my grandfather had left unfinished. I did not burden her with the terrifying specifics of the entity or the risk of my soul. I spoke of duty, of the necessity of closing a door that had been left ajar. She listened, her hands resting on the table, her expression shifting from concern to a quiet resolve. She did not interrupt. She did not ask the frantic questions another might have asked. She knew me. She knew the Morrisons. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then she reached across the table and took my hand in hers. Her grip was firm, grounding. She told me to come back to her. It was not a plea. It was an instruction. She said, "Whatever is down there, Tom, you face it, and you come back. Do you understand?" I told her I understood. She stood up then and walked to our bedroom. When she returned, she was holding a small object I hadn't seen in years. It was my grandfather's sheriff's badge, the one Jonas Morrison had worn for 30 years. It was worn smooth at the edges, the metal dull with age. She had kept it in her jewelry box, safe among the family heirlooms. She pressed the badge into my palm, closing my fingers over it. She told me that he had faced this, and he had returned. She said that I came from strong stock, and that I would do the same. I felt the cool metal against my skin, and with it, the weight of history. 3 generations of men who had stood between their community and the darkness. I realized then that I was not going down there alone. Even beyond the team I had assembled, I was carrying the legacy of those who had come before. I would not be the one to break that chain. I slept little that night, my mind drifting between the warmth of my home and the cold, dark waters waiting in the deep. The next morning, we assembled at the mine entrance at first light. The world was frozen, suspended in the gray twilight of dawn. The temperature had dropped even further overnight, reaching minus 43 degrees. It was a kind of cold that makes the air itself seem brittle, as if the sky might crack like glass. Henry Whitefeather was there, leaning on a walking stick wrapped in colorful blankets, his breath misting in the air. Margaret held the keys, her hand steady despite the biting chill. Eric stood like a sentinel, his backpack seemingly light on his broad shoulders. Mike checked his equipment one last time, his eyes meeting mine with a nod of readiness. I carried my grandfather's badge in my pocket, right next to the leather pouch Henry had given me. We did not waste time with speeches. The time for words had passed. Margaret stepped forward and unlocked the heavy steel entrance. We filed inside, and the door clanged shut behind us, sealing out the winter and the morning light. We were committed. The transition was immediate and visceral. As the heavy steel door sealed behind us, the howling wind of the Iron Range was instantly cut off, replaced by the profound, muffled silence of the underground. The air here was still, devoid of the biting frost we had just left, carrying instead the scent of damp earth and old metal. We moved toward the elevator shaft, our footsteps echoing on the concrete floor of the access tunnel. The maintenance lights flickered overhead, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to stretch out ahead of us, guiding our way into the depths. The elevator itself was an industrial cage, a utilitarian structure of steel mesh and heavy beams designed to haul men and ore, not to provide comfort. We stepped inside, the metal grating of the floor allowing us a glimpse of the dark shaft yawning beneath our feet. Margaret took her place at the controls, her familiarity with the machinery evident in her confident movements. With a mechanical lurch and a deep groan of cables, we began our descent. The sensation was disorienting, the stomach-dropping feeling of falling control by machinery. We watched the level markers pass by, painted numbers on the rock walls flashing in the dim light of the cage. Level 5, Level 10, Level 15. Each number represented hundreds of feet of solid rock, now separating us from the surface world. The ride to Level 27 felt significantly longer than it had the previous day. Perhaps it was the anticipation, the knowledge of what we were intending to do. Or perhaps it was the silence of the group, No one spoke. The rattling of the cage and hum of the lift motor were the only sounds, a rhythmic cadence that seemed to count down the seconds. I looked at my companions. Henry stood with his eyes closed, his head tilted slightly as if listening to a song only he could hear. Eric watched the rock walls slide past, his expression unreadable, a man returning to a familiar, if formidable, workplace. Mike watched the floor, his hands gripping the safety rail, his knuckles white. Margaret's eyes were fixed on the controls, her focus absolute. Finally, the elevator slowed, the groan of the cables deepening as the brakes engaged. We jerked to a halt at level 27. The gate rattled open, and we stepped out into the vast, cavernous chamber we had visited the day before. The air here was warm, a humid 50 degrees that felt tropical after the surface. But it was a heavy warmth, pressing against the skin. Henry stepped out first. He walked to the center of the chamber and stood motionless. After a moment, he opened his eyes and looked at us. He said simply that it knew we were here. It was waiting. We followed the main tunnel, retracing our steps to the seal wall. The flashlight beams cut through the darkness, illuminating the rusted remnants of the mine's past, abandoned tracks, old ventilation pipes, the ghosts of industry. When we reached the concrete seal, the reality of our task stood before us. This was a barrier my grandfather had erected, the line in the sand. Now we had to cross it. Eric and Mike stepped forward. They had brought the heavy tools, the sledgehammer and the pry bar. Without a word, they set to work. The sound of metal striking concrete was deafening in the confined space, a violent intrusion into the silence, the deep. Chips of concrete flew, dust rising in choking clouds that danced in our flashlight beams. They worked with a rhythmic intensity, taking turns to preserve their strength. It took 20 minutes of hard labor to breach the seal. First, a crack appeared in a small hole, and finally, chunks of the barrier began to fall away, revealing the darkness beyond. When the opening was large enough for a man to crawl through, they stopped, breathing hard, sweat glistening on their foreheads. Mike shone his flashlight through the jagged gap. The beam did not hit a mine wall. Instead, it disappeared into a vast emptiness. The tunnel beyond was not man-made. It was a natural cave, the walls rough and glistening with moisture, formed by geological processes over millennia. A draft of air flowed out from the hole, carrying a scent that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was colder than the mine air, and it smelled of deep, stagnant water and something else, ozone perhaps, or the metallic tang of an approaching storm. I moved to go first, but Eric put a hand on my shoulder. He shook his head, stating that he was bigger and should lead. If there was a physical danger immediately on the other side, he was best equipped to handle it. He insisted I follow right behind him. I nodded, respecting his logic and his courage. He lowered himself to the floor and crawled to the opening, his broad shoulders barely fitting through the gap. We watched his boots disappear, then heard the sound of him standing up on the other side. His voice echoed back to us, distorted by the rock, but clear enough. He reported that it was clear. One by one, we followed. I crawled through the dust and debris, the rough concrete scraping my jacket. As I emerged on the other side, I stood up and played my light around the space. We were in a natural limestone tunnel, the ceiling low and covered in small stalactites that dripped water with a steady, rhythmic plink, plink, plink. The floor was uneven, slick with mud. Margaret came through last, dragging our pack of supplies. We gathered together. For small points of light in an immense darkness, Henry moved to the front of the group. He cautioned us to stay close, warning that the path was treacherous. We began to walk deeper into the earth. The tunnel twisted and turned, following the logic of water rather than the straight lines of engineering. At times, it narrowed so much that we had to turn sideways to squeeze through. At other times, it opened up into small chambers where our lights could barely find the ceiling. The sound of water grew louder as we descended. Not the dripping we had heard earlier, but a deeper, more resonant sound, like the breathing of a great ocean. We walked for what felt like hours, though my watch told me it was only 30 minutes. The sense of time seemed to distort down here, stretching and compressing in the dark. The air grew colder with every step, the humidity condensing on our clothes. And then, the tunnel widened abruptly. We stepped out onto a ledge and stopped, our lights failing to penetrate the vastness before us. We had arrived. We were standing on the shore of a colossal underground cavern, and in the center, stretching out into the darkness, was a lake. It was perfectly still, a mirror of black glass. But as we watched, a glow began to emanate from the depths. It started as a faint pulse, then grew in intensity, that same sickening yellow-green light we had seen on the surface. But here it was concentrated, powerful. It illuminated the water from below, casting eerie, shifting shadows on the cavern walls. We were staring at the source, the place where the deep earth met the ancient water, the place where the cycle began. We stood in silence, witnessing the impossible, knowing that the only way out was through the task we had come to perform. The water pulsed again, a silent heartbeat, and I knew that Henry was right. It was awake. We stood on the precipice of the unknown, for figures dwarfed by the sheer scale of the cavern that opened before us. The air here was different, charged with an energy that made the skin prickle, a static heaviness that tasted of ozone and ancient minerals. The underground lake stretched out into the darkness, its boundaries lost to the limited reach of our flashlights. The surface of the water was eerily still, undisturbed by wind or current, yet possessed a vitality that was palpable. It was not merely a body of water. It felt like a presence, a silent observer waiting in the dark. The yellow-green glow that permeated the depths was mesmerizing and unsettling in equal measure. It did not behave like natural light. It pulsed with a slow, rhythmic cadence, expanding and contracting like the breath of a sleeping giant. As my eyes adjusted to the strange illumination, I began to perceive details within the water that defied explanation. The light revealed shapes suspended in the depths, shadowy forms that drifted in the silent currents. At first, my mind tried to categorize them as geological formations, perhaps stalagmites rising from the lakebed or clusters of aquatic flora unique to the subterranean ecosystem. But as we moved closer to the water's edge, the truth became undeniable. They were bodies, dozens of them, perhaps more, suspended in the glowing liquid-like specimens in a jar. They floated with serene, terrifying grace, their limbs drifting lazily in the subtle movements of the water. Some appeared ancient, reduced to skeletal remnants that gleamed white in strange light. Others looked disturbingly recent, their clothing preserved, their features intact. The water, it seemed, possessed properties that halted the natural process of decay, holding these lost souls in a state of suspended animation. It was a museum of the missing, a silent testament to the cycle that Henry had described. I scanned the nearest forms, my heart hammering against my ribs. And then I saw him, drifting near the surface, perhaps 10 feet from where we stood, was Jim Kowalski. He looked exactly as he had the last time I saw him in town, wearing his heavy flannel shirt and fishing bibs. His eyes were wide open, staring up through the water with an expression of frozen shock. His mouth was open as if in a silent shout. He was not decomposing. He was perfectly preserved, caught in the moment of his taking. Seeing a man I had known for years, a man I had shared coffee with, floating in this alien abyss, brought the reality of our situation crashing down on me. This was not a story anymore. This was a tragedy, visceral and immediate. Margaret gasped beside me, her hand flying to her mouth. She whispered a prayer, her voice trembling in the cavernous silence. Eric stood like a stone statue, his jaw set hard, his eyes fixed on the water. Mike turned away for a moment, overcome by the sight, before steeling himself and looking back. We were witnessing the cost of the cycle, the human toll of the entity's hunger. It was a profound violation of the natural order, a theft of peace from those who had passed. Then the water began to change. It was not a wave, but a disturbance from deep below. The glow intensified, brightening until the entire cavern was bathed in that sickly, verdant light. The temperature plummeted rapidly, our breath now coming in thick, heavy clouds. Frost began to creep across the stone shore, crystallizing in intricate patterns that moved toward our boots. The stillness was broken. The sleeper was waking. Henry's voice cut to the rising tension, urgent and clear. He commanded us to begin the ceremony immediately. There was no time to mourn, no time to process the horror. We had to act. He directed us to our positions. The ritual required a specific geometry, a binding circle formed by human will. He placed Era to the north, a pillar of strength against the cold. Margaret took the east, the direction of sunrise and beginnings. Mike stood at the south, representing the fire of youth and action. And I, carrying the weight of my grandfather's legacy, took the west, the direction of the setting sun and endings. Henry stood in the center, the axis around which our efforts would turn. He pulled items from his pack with deliberate speed, a small weathered drum, a bundle of dried sage, and a container of what he called sacred fire. He lit the sage, and the pungent, earthy smoke began to fill the space, drifting over the water and mingling with the strange light. Then he began to chant. It was a low, rhythmic sound that seemed to rise from his chest and resonate with the stone walls of the cavern. It was not a song in the traditional sense. It was a vibration, a frequency designed to speak to the earth. He instructed us when to speak, guiding us through the phonetic sounds of the Ojibwe words he had taught us. They were unfamiliar on my tongue, guttural and flowing, but as I spoke them, they felt strangely right, as if the capacity to say them had been waiting in my blood. The reaction from the lake was immediate. The water began to churn, great bubbles rising to the surface and bursting with the smell of ozone. The suspended bodies began to spin slowly in the agitated current, a macabre dance of the dead. The light pulsed faster, frantic now, like a hardened panic. We stood our ground. For tiny figures against a rising tide of the unknown, our voices joining Henry's in a chorus of binding. The air grew heavy, pressing down on us with a physical weight. I could feel the resistance, the entity pushing back against our intrusion. It did not want to be bound. It wanted to feed. But we held the line. We stood firm in our positions, anchored by our purpose and the memory of the men floating in the water before us. This was the moment the Morrisons had been preparing for since 1944. The atmosphere in the cavern shifted from heavy to oppressive, a tangible pressure that pushed against our chests and made drawing breath a labor. The water in the center of the lake began to mound upward, defying gravity, rising like a sculpted pillar of liquid glass. It was a mesmerizing and terrifying sight. The yellow-green fluid coalescing into a form that towered 20 feet above the surface. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, a giant constructed of living water, shifting and flowing, yet holding a coherent structure. Where a face had been, there was only a swirling void of darker liquid, a hollow space that radiated a profound and ancient hunger. This was the entity, the water that hungers. It did not have eyes, yet I felt its gaze piercing through me, laying bare my fears and my history. It spoke, not with a voice that vibrated the air, but directly into our minds. It was a sensation like ice water trickling down the spine, a cold, resonant thought that bypassed the ears entirely. "Why do you disturb my sleep?" It asked. "Why do you deny me my feeding?" The voice was ancient, weary, and cold, devoid of human empathy, driven only by the primal necessity of its existence. We did not falter. We continued to chant, our voices gaining strength from the sheer necessity of the moment. Henry moved with a vigor that belied his 89 years. He threw a handful of tobacco into the churning water, an offering of earth. Then he poured the contents of a small vial, the ghost water he had collected from a spring that never froze. Finally, he scattered iron filings, taken from the very floor of the mine, across the surface of the lake. As he did so, he spoke words of binding and containment, old words that commanded the earth to hold fast. The creature screamed. It was a sound that was not a sound, a psychic shriek that tore at our minds, threatening to overwhelm our senses with a wave of despair and terror. I felt a physical pull, a magnetic drag urging me to step forward, to walk into the water, to give myself over to the cold. Beside me, Margaret stumbled, her knees buckling under the psychic assault. Eric, true to his nature, broke his stance just enough to grab her arm, his massive strength keeping her upright. Henry shouted over the psychic din, his voice cracking but commanding. The circle must not break. Keep speaking. Don't stop. We redoubled our efforts, shouting the words of binding into the face of the entity. The creature thrashed, sending great waves of glowing water crashing against the stone shore. The spray hit us like freezing rain, soaking our clothes and chilling us to bone. Some of the preserved bodies were thrown from the lake by the violence of the waves, landing on the stone with wet, heavy thuds. Jim Kowalski's body landed near me, sliding to a stop on the icy rock, his frozen expression of terror now staring up at the cavern ceiling. It was a gruesome reminder of the stakes. If we failed, there would be more bodies, more families left wondering. Then, Henry pulled a small knife from his belt. The blade glinted in the eerie light. Before I could react, he drew the sharp edge across his palm. Blood welled up, dark and rich against his weathered skin. He held his hand out over the water, letting the droplets fall into the churning lake. He spoke clearly, his voice cutting through the chaos. "This is the old bargain," he said. "Blood for binding. One life freely given contained the hunger." I shouted a denial, fearing he meant to sacrifice himself entirely. But he shook his head, his eyes locking with mine. "Not my life, Sheriff," he clarified. "Just my blood. The willingness to sacrifice is what it understands." I understood then. It was a symbolic offering, a demonstration of our commitment to protect this world. I pulled out my own pocket knife. The steel felt cold and hard. I did not hesitate. I cut my palm, the sting sharp and grounding. I let my blood mix with Henry's in the water. Eric followed suit without a word, his face grim. Mike did the same. Finally, Margaret, her hand trembling but her resolve firm, added her offering to the lake. Our blood hit the glowing water, and the reaction was instantaneous. The chemical, or perhaps spiritual, composition of the lake changed. The yellow-green glow began to dim, retreating from the surface. The towering form of the entity wavered, losing its cohesion. It let out one final, diminishing cry, a sound of frustration and retreating power. The water collapsed back into the lake with a thunderous crash, sending a final wave washing over our boots. The glow faded rapidly, growing fainter and fainter until the cavern was plunged back into natural darkness, illuminated only by the frantic beams of our flashlights. The water settled, becoming once again a still, black mirror. The oppressive presence lifted, leaving behind only the cold damp of the cave. The ceremony was over. We stood there in the ringing silence, chests heaving, adrenaline fading into exhaustion. Henry collapsed, his legs finally giving way. Eric caught him before he hit the ground, lowering him gently to the stone. The old man was breathing hard, his face gray and drawn, but his eyes were open and alive. He whispered that it was done. It was bound for another 40 years, perhaps longer if we had done it correctly. We took a moment to collect ourselves, checking for injuries, offering silent reassurance to one another. Then, the grim work of the aftermath began. We gathered Jim Kowalski's body and the remains of 4 others that had been washed ashore. It was a somber task, carrying the dead back through the twisting tunnels, dragging them through the narrow gaps, and hauling them up the elevator shaft. It took 2 trips to bring them all to the surface. We emerged into the bitter cold of the February afternoon. It was past noon, the sun high and bright, though it offered no heat. The world looked exactly the same as we had left it, indifferent to the struggle that had taken place beneath its crust. We contacted the state police to report the recovery of the bodies. We concocted a story about finding them in an old, unstable mine shaft, victims of a tragic accident. The authorities, accustomed to the dangers of the Iron Range, did not press too hard for details. In this part of the world, People understood that sometimes the earth took what it wanted, and it was better not to dig too deep into the reasons why. Jim Kowalski's funeral was held 3 days later. The entire town turned out to pay their respects. I stood by the grave, watching the snowfall on the coffin, listening to the vicar's words about peace and rest. Carol Kowalski wept on my shoulder, thanking me for bringing her husband home. I held her, accepting her gratitude while carrying the weight of the truth I could never share. I did not tell her where I had really found him. I did not tell her what had taken him. Some truths are too heavy for the grieving to bear. We had done our duty. We had protected the town. But as I looked at the frozen ground, I knew that the peace we had bought was temporary. The cycle would turn again. 2 weeks after the funeral, life in Tower began to return to its familiar, quiet rhythm. The snow continued to fall, the wind continued to howl, and the ice on Vermilion Lake remained thick and unyielding. But for me, the world had fundamentally changed. I carried the memory of the glowing water and the ancient voice like a stone in my pocket, a constant reminder of the thin veil separating our reality from the unknown. I was sitting in my office, processing the routine paperwork that constitutes the bulk of a sheriff's life, when Betty buzzed me. She announced a call from the University of Minnesota, a professor wishing to speak with me. I picked up the phone, my guard immediately rising. The voice on the other end introduced herself as Dr. Scarlett James from the Department of Geology. She was polite, professional, and entirely unaware of the tension her words were creating. She explained that her department had been monitoring seismic activity in the region and had detected some highly unusual readings emanating from the area beneath Vermilion Lake. They were interested in sending a team up to investigate these anomalies. My blood ran cold. The last thing we needed was a team of curious scientists probing the very place we had just sealed. I adopted my most authoritative, dismissive tone. I told her firmly that such an investigation would not be necessary. I explained away the readings as merely the settling of old mine shafts, a common occurrence in the Iron Range that locals dealt with regularly. She pressed, noting that the specific frequency of the readings was quite unusual, almost rhythmic. I cut her off, perhaps more abruptly than was polite, assuring her that I was certain of my assessment and thanking her for her concern. I hung up the phone and stared out the window at the stark winter landscape. The ice was solid. It would remain so for another month at least. Beneath it, in the deep places, the entity slept. We had bound it, yes, but we had not destroyed it. And Dr. James's call was a reminder that science was catching up to mythology. In 40 years, maybe less, it would wake again. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out my grandfather's badge, the one Susan had given me before I went into the mine. It felt warm in my hand. 3 generations of Morrisons had faced this thing. Jonas in 1944. Myself in 1984. In 40 years, it would be someone else's turn. My daughters were young now, building lives far away from the mines and the cold. But who knew what the future held? Perhaps one of them would return to the Iron Range. Perhaps one of them would wear this badge. The thought filled me with a complex mixture of pride and dread. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a fresh manila folder. Into it, I placed everything. Henry's hand-drawn maps of the cave systems, my grandfather's weathered notes, and the letter he had left for me, my own detailed reports of the ceremony, the coordinates of the sealed tunnel, and the specific words Henry had taught us. I added one more document to collection, a letter addressed to whoever came after me, to the next sheriff who would have to stand between the town and the darkness. I wrote it with the same sense of urgency my grandfather must have felt, pouring my experience onto the page. Then I sealed the folder and locked in the drawer, just as Jonas had done before me. The cycle would continue, but we had purchased 40 more years of safety, 40 years of quiet winters, of frozen lakes where families could fish in peace, of children growing up without fear of the deep water. 40 years before someone else would have to descend into the darkness. Outside, the wind whipped snow across the streets of Tower, and somewhere deep beneath the frozen earth, in water that hungered, something ancient dreamed of waking. Time moved on, as it always does. The seasons turned, years stacked upon years. The members of our small circle began to fade. Henry Whitefeather passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 years later. His spirit finally joined the ancestors he had served so well. We buried him with honors, and I placed a small piece of iron ore in his grave, a silent token of our shared bond. Eric Erickson retired from the fire department and eventually moved south to live with his son, his strength finally succumbing to age. Mike Carlson took over as sheriff when I retired, a good man who carried the secret with stoic resolve until his own passing. And I grew old. I retired from the department, content to watch the seasons change on my porch. My hand began to shake, arthritis claiming the joints, but the memories remained sharp as glass. February 2024 arrived. 40 years to the day since I stood in that underground cavern. I was 72 years old now, living in the same house where I had raised my family. My wife, Susan, had passed 5 years prior, leaving a silence in a house that I filled with books and memories. But I was not alone in the town. My daughter, Emma, had returned. She had followed in the family footsteps, not just returning to the Iron Range, but taking up the badge. Emma was the sheriff of St. Louis County now. She was different from me, sharper, more modern, skeptical of the old ways, but deeply committed to the law. I watched her with pride, but also with a growing knot of anxiety in my stomach. The calendar had turned. The cycle was complete. The winter of 2024 was brutal, echoing the severity of 1984. The polar vortex had descended upon Minnesota, plunging the temperatures to record lows. The air was a physical assault, stinging exposed skin and turning breath to ice crystals instantly. The ice on Vermilion Lake was thick, a vast white expanse that drew the fishermen out in their droves, just as it always did. I sat in my living room, watching the snow pile up against the window, waiting. I knew it was coming. I could feel in my bones, a deep ache that had nothing to do with the weather. It started with a phone call, just as it had 40 years ago. But this time, the call was not for me. It was for Sheriff Emma Morrison. I heard about it later that evening when she came to visit, her face drawn and pale. A young college student named Jessica Hartley had gone missing. She had been ice fishing near the center of the lake, doing research for a climate study. She had not returned to her dorm. Her friends had found her gear abandoned on the ice. Emma sat at my kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee, looking for all the world like I did 4 decades ago. She described the scene to me. The abandoned equipment, the lack of tracks leading away, and then the detail that made my heart stop. She mentioned the hole. She said the fishing hole wasn't frozen over, despite the extreme cold. She said there was a light coming from beneath the ice, a strange, sickly yellow-green glow. She asked me if I had ever seen anything like it in my years on the force. I looked at my daughter, a woman of science and law, a woman who believed in evidence and procedure. I saw the confusion in her eyes, the fear of the inexplicable. I knew that I could not protect her by keeping silence any longer. To hide the truth now would be to send her into the darkness unprepared. I stood up slowly, my joints protesting, and walked to the old desk in the corner of the room, the desk I had brought home from the station when I retired. I unlocked the bottom drawer and pulled out the manila folder. It was yellowed with age, the edges soft and worn. I placed it on the table in front of her. She looked at it, then at me, confused. I told her to open it. She flipped through the pages. Henry's maps, Jonas's notes, the photographs from 1904, and my own report from 1984. As she read, I saw the skepticism war with the reality of what she had seen on the lake. She looked up at me, her eyes wide. She asked a question that I had asked Henry all those years ago. Is monsters real? It was a child's question, spoken by a woman facing a nightmare. I sat down opposite her and began to speak. I told her everything. The story of the Morrisons is not just a story of law enforcement. It is a story of guardianship. I told her about the entity, about the cycle, about the binding. I told her about the sacrifice required to keep the town safe. I watched the realization settle over her. She was not just investigating a missing person. She was stepping into a hereditary war. But then, I had to share my greatest fear. The binding we performed in 1984, it was desperate. We were 4 people standing against a force of nature. We had succeeded, but only just. I told her that I feared the entity had grown stronger in its sleep. The world had changed. The environment had changed. If the entity had evolved, if it had adapted, the old ritual, the chanting, the blood, the iron might not be enough this time. We couldn't rely solely on the methods of the past. Emma listened, her mind already working, analyzing, strategizing. She was her mother's daughter, practical, intelligent, unwilling to be defeated. She closed the folder and looked at me. She said that if this thing was real, if it was a biological or geological entity, then it had weaknesses. It followed rules of physics, even if we didn't understand them yet. She said we couldn't just rely on folklore. We needed to bring in help. We needed to understand what we were fighting. She asked me if I remembered the professor from the university, the one I had brushed off in 1984. I nodded. Dr. Scarlett James. Emma pulled out her phone and began to search. It didn't take long. Dr. James was still alive, now an emeritus professor, a legend in her field. Emma said she was going to call her. She said we needed to bridge the gap between the old ways and the new. We needed science to validate the myth. I felt a surge of hope I hadn't expected. My generation had faced the darkness with faith and grit. Emma's generation would face it with data and technology. It was a new approach for a new era. She made the call. I listened as she introduced herself, as she mentioned the seismic anomalies of 1984, as she described what was happening now. I could hear the voice on the other end change, the tone shifting from curiosity to urgency. Dr. James had been waiting for this call for 40 years. Emma hung up the phone. She looked at me, a new determination in her eyes. She said Dr. James was coming. She was bringing equipment, sensors, radar. We were going to map the beast. We were going to understand it. And then we were going to stop it. I looked at the map on the table, at the circle of red dots marking the old disappearances. Emma picked up a red marker and added a new dot for Jessica Hartley. Then she added 2 more for reports that had just come in from neighboring counties. She traced a line connecting them. In 1984, the pattern had been a circle. Now, in 2024, the dots formed a spiral widening outward. The entity was changing its hunting grounds. The cycle had returned, but the rules had changed. We had work to do. The atmosphere in the house had shifted significantly after Emma's arrival. What began as a solemn exchange between father and daughter had evolved into a council war, albeit one waged with maps and memories rather than weapons. The manila folder lay open on the table, its contents a bridge spanning 80 years of silence. I watched Emma study the documents with a focus that reminded me painfully of my wife, Susan. There was no panic in her eyes, only a calculating intensity, a desire to deconstruct the problem before her. She was not just accepting the burden I had carried. She was analyzing its weight, testing its edges. She looked up from Henry's hand-drawn map of the cave system and asked me directly about the nature of the binding. She wanted to know why it had held for 40 years and why it was failing now. I leaned back in my chair, the wood creaking in the quiet room. I explained that the binding was not a permanent seal, but a cycle of containment. It was based on the rhythm of the earth itself. 40 years was a generation. It was enough time for a community to forget, for the fear to fade into legend. But for the entity, 40 years was merely a nap. The energy we had expended in 1984, the ritual, the intent, the blood, was finite. It had worn thin, eroded by the relentless pressure of the creature's hunger. I confessed to her that I had always known this day would come, but I had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that the world might have found a way to move beyond such ancient fears. Instead, the world had simply grown louder, brighter, while the dark places remained just as deep. Emma listened, absorbing the emotional toll of confession. She reached across the table and took my hand, her grip firm and warm. She told me that I had done what was necessary for my time. I had bought them safety. Now, it was her turn to decide how to use that safety to forge a solution. This moment, this passing of the torch, felt less like a resignation and more like an evolution. The Morrisons had always been guardians, but the nature of guardianship was changing. My grandfather, Jonas, had relied on courage and intuition. I had relied on tradition and ritual. Emma was different. She represented a synthesis. She respected the past, but she refused to be bound by its limitations. She spoke of integrating the old knowledge with modern understanding, of finding the intersection where folklore met physics. She brought up the concept of the spiral again. She traced a pattern of the recent disappearances on the map. Jessica Hartley near the center, then 2 other reports further out. The entity was not just waking up. It was expanding. Its influence was radiating outward like ripples in a pond, reaching for new sources of vitality. Emma theorized that the entity was learning, adapting to constraints we had placed upon it. If we simply repeated the ritual of 1984, we might just be feeding it the very energy it expected. We needed to surprise it. We needed a new variable. She spoke of Dr. Scarlett James with a reverence I hadn't expected. To Emma, Dr. James wasn't just a geologist. She was a pioneer who had tried to warn us. Emma believed that by ignoring her in 1984, we had missed a crucial piece of the puzzle. We had treated the symptom, the monster, without understanding the disease, the geological and biological reality of the creature. Emma was determined to correct that mistake. She stood up, pacing the small kitchen, her energy filling the room. She declared that we would not go back into the mine as frightened men performing a desperate act. We would go in as explorers, as scientists, as a team equipped to understand the very nature of the beast. I felt a profound sense of relief wash over me. For 40 years, I had feared that passing this legacy on would be a curse, a sentence of fear for my children. But Emma wasn't afraid. She was challenged. She saw this not as a doom to be endured, but as a problem to be solved. She was transforming the narrative from one of survival to one of mastery. She looked at me and smiled, expression that held both love and steel. She said we had work to do, and that we needed to prepare the house for a guest. Dr. James was on her way. Dr. Scarlett James arrived 2 days later, driving a heavy-duty university van that looked ready for an expedition to the Arctic. She was a woman of diminutive stature but immense presence, her white hair cut in a sharp bob, her eyes bright with intelligence that time had not dimmed. When she stepped onto my porch, she carried a heavy case of equipment in one hand and a tablet in the other. She looked at me and then at Emma and simply said that it was about time. There was no resentment in her voice, only the brisk efficiency of someone who has waited a lifetime for validation. We gathered in the living room, which Emma had transformed into a command center. Maps covered the walls, and laptops hummed on the coffee table. Dr. James wasted no time. She opened her case and began to set up her equipment. Seismic monitors, ground-penetrating radar displays, and spectral analyzers. She connected her tablet to the main screen and pulled up a graph that looked like a chaotic heartbeat. She pointed to the spikes in the data. She explained that for the past 40 years, she had kept a passive sensor array running in the region, funded by small grants and her own stubborn curiosity. She showed us the data from 1984, a massive spike in energy, followed by a sudden, sharp drop-off on the day of our ritual. It was a scientific signature of the binding. She then scrolled to the present day. The graph showed a slow, rhythmic build-up over the last 6 months, a crescendo of energy that was perfectly synchronized with the lunar cycles. She confirmed Emma's theory. The entity was not just a spirit. It was a biological organism of immense size, living within the aquifer. It had a metabolism, a sleep cycle, and a feeding pattern. Dr. James called it a macrobiological subterranean idarian, a massive, liquid-based life form that functioned like a jellyfish made of water and energy. It existed in a state of suspended animation for decades, gathering geothermal energy, and then woke to feed on bioelectric energy, the life force Henry had spoken of. The ghosts and spirits were his way of luring prey, of interacting with the consciousness of sentient beings. It wasn't magic. It was a highly advanced form of biological predation. Emma absorbed this information with intense focus. This changed everything. If the entity was biological, it had physical vulnerabilities. It could be tracked, measured, and potentially disrupted. The binding we performed, the iron, the blood, the sonic resonance of chanting. Dr. James theorized that these were actually crude but effective ways of disrupting the creature's electromagnetic field. The iron acted as a grounding agent. The blood provided the biological marker. The chanting created a resonant frequency that interfered with its cohesion. We had been performing science without knowing it. Dr. James then overlaid a new map onto the screen. It showed the water table beneath the iron range. She pointed out that the aquifer under Vermilion Lake was not isolated. It was connected to a vast network of underground waterways that stretched across the state, perhaps even the continent. She traced the lines of the spiral Emma had noticed. The creature was expanding its reach because it was trying to connect with other pockets of water. It was trying to grow. The implication was terrifying. If the entity succeeded in linking with the broader water table, it wouldn't just be a local legend anymore. It could spread its influence to other lakes, to rivers, to the Great Lakes themselves. It could become a systemic infection of the region's water. We weren't just fighting for Tower anymore. We were fighting to contain a potential ecological catastrophe. Emma looked at the map, then at Dr. James, then at me. She realized the scale of the threat. The binding of 1984 had been a local quarantine. The mission now was to prevent a breakout. She asked Dr. James if her equipment could detect the creature's core, its brain, or central processing node. Dr. James nodded. She believed the core was located in the central chamber we had visited, the place where the energy was most concentrated. Emma formulated a plan. We needed to go back to the source. But this time, we wouldn't just chant at it. We would bring the full weight of modern technology. We would use Dr. James's sensors to map its frequency, and then we would use that data to amplify the ritual. We would create a feedback loop, a sonic and electromagnetic cage that wouldn't just put it to sleep, but would lock it down completely. It was a bold strategy, risky and untested. We spent the rest of the night refining the plan. Dr. James calibrated her sensors. Emma coordinated the logistics, gathering supplies and ensuring we had access to mine. I sat back and watched them work, the old sheriff and the young scientist forging a new alliance. I felt a sense of awe at their capability. The fear was still there, sitting in the corner of the room like a dark shadow, but it was being pushed back by the light of knowledge. We were no longer stumbling in the dark. We had a map, we had a theory, and we had a team. The old cycle was ending. A new one was beginning. The transformation of my living room into a nerve center of operations marked a definitive shift in our approach. We were no longer merely reacting to an ancient curse. We were actively strategizing against a formidable biological adversary. The team that gathered in the pale light of the following morning was a testament to this new philosophy, a blend of heritage and innovation, of the mystical and the empirical. Emma Morrison stood at the center of it all. As the current sheriff, she naturally assumed the mantle of leadership, but her authority came from more than just her badge. It came from her ability to bridge the gap between her father's world and the demands of the present. She checked her equipment with a practice comm, radios, climbing gear, and a tablet loaded with Dr. James's mapping software. She wore a heavy parka that reminded me of my own from 1984, a visual echo of the continuity between us. To her right stood Dr. Scarlett James. The geologist looked out of place in her heavy winter gear, yet her eyes shone with the fierce determination of a scientist on the brink of a career-defining discovery. She fussed over a portable sensor array, a device bristling with antennas and probes designed to read the electromagnetic pulse of the Earth. For her, this was not just a rescue mission. It was a validation of a lifetime of marginalized research. She carried the weight of 40 years of being ignored, transforming that frustration into a laser-focused resolve. And then there was Officer David Whitefeather. He was the great-grandson of Henry, the man who had guided my grandfather and me through the darkness. David was a young man, barely 30, with the broad shoulders and quiet demeanor of his ancestors. He served on the tribal police force and had grown up straddling two worlds, the modern reality of law enforcement and the deep, spiritual traditions of the Ojibwe. When Emma had reached out to him, he had not hesitated. He arrived carrying a large, circular case slung over his back. Inside, he told us, was a spirit drum, an heirloom passed down through his family, specifically prepared for ceremonies of great weight. He brought a grounding presence to the group, a reminder that while our tools had changed, the spiritual stakes remained the same. I rounded out the group, the veteran, the living memory. I carried no new technology, only the knowledge of the terrain and the experience of what it felt like to stand before the abyss. My role was to guide, to warn, and to witness. As we loaded the vehicles, the air was crisp and cold, the sky a brilliant, indifferent blue. We drove in a convoy to the Sudan mine, the tires crunching loudly on the frozen gravel. The journey felt different this time. In 1984, we had driven in silence, burdened by dread. Today, there was a hum of focused energy. We were not going to a funeral. We were going to work. When we arrived at the mine entrance, the sense of déjà vu was overwhelming. The steel door, the rusted hinges, the smell of damp earth. It was all exactly as I remembered. Yet, the context had shifted. Dr. James immediately began taking readings at the entrance, establishing a baseline. Emma coordinated our entry with the surface team she had placed on standby, a precaution I had never thought to take. David paused at the threshold, whispering a quiet prayer in his native tongue, honoring the spirits of the place before we trespassed in their domain. We descended into the earth, the elevator cage rattling and swaying just as it had 40 years ago. But where I had once felt only the crushing weight of the rock, I now felt a strange sense of anticipation. We were bringing light into the darkness, not just the beams of our flashlights, but the light of understanding. We stepped out onto level 27, the air warm and heavy with the scent of iron. The silence of the deep earth enveloped us, but this time we filled it with the beep of sensors and the crackle of radios. We were the new guardians, armed with the best of both worlds, ready to face whatever waited in the dark. The journey through the mine tunnels was a surreal blending of past and present. I found myself walking paths I had navigated in my nightmares for decades, but now I was flanked by the steady green glow of Dr. James's instruments and the reassuring presence of my daughter. We reached the sealed wall, or rather, the place where the seal had been. The concrete patch my team had broken through in 1984 had been roughly repaired by the mine's maintenance crew years later, but it was nothing more than a cosmetic fix. It took David and Emma only a few minutes with modern pry bars to clear the debris and open the way. We crawled through the opening, leaving the structured world of the mine behind and entering the chaotic, natural architecture of the cave system. The air here was colder, carrying that familiar, metallic tang of ozone in deep water. Dr. James was entranced, stopping frequently to examine rock formations and take readings. She noted that the ionization levels in the air were off the charts, consistent with a massive biological energy source. Every step we took confirmed her theories. The cave was not just a geological feature, but a container for something alive. As we neared the great cavern, the sound of the underground lake reached us. It was louder than I remembered, a rhythmic, sloshing sound that echoed against the stone walls. And there was something else, a low, humming vibration that we could feel in our teeth. Dr. James checked her tablet and showed it to us. The graph was spiking wildly. The entity was active, far more active than it had been during my first encounter. We emerged onto the shore of the underground lake, and the sight that greeted us stopped us in our tracks. The water level was significantly higher. Encroaching on the stone ledge where we stood, the yellow-green glow was intense, illuminating the entire cavern with a harsh, pulsating radiance. But it was the water itself that held our attention. It was moving with a violent, restless energy, churning and swirling in complex patterns. The bodies, the tragic collections of the taken, were spinning in the current, moving faster than before, as if caught in a centrifuge. Dr. James set up her tripod and sensors near the water's edge, her hands moving with practiced speed. Emma and David took flanking positions, scanning the water for threats. I stood near the center, watching, and then it rose. But it was not the singular, towering figure I had faced in 1984. The water erupted in two distinct places. Two forms began to coalesce from the glowing liquid. One was massive, a hulking shape that dwarfed the entity I remembered. The other was smaller, perhaps half the size, but moved with a frantic, darting energy. The creature had reproduced, or perhaps it split, dividing its consciousness to cover more ground. The entity solidified, their forms shifting and flowing like mercury. They did not have faces, but they had presence. The larger one leaned toward us, and the voice that invaded our minds was stronger, clearer, and far more terrifying. We will spread, it intoned, a chorus of thoughts speaking as one. We will infect all waters. The psychic impact was staggering. It wasn't just a statement of intent. It was a vision shared directly into our consciousness. For a split second, we all saw what the entity intended. A network of glowing green veins spreading through the earth, poised in the aquifers, rising in lakes and rivers across the continent. We saw the Great Lakes turning a sickly yellow-green. We saw the world's water becoming a predator. Dr. James shouted over the psychic noise, pointing at her screen. It's a hive mind. They are communicating. The frequencies are synchronizing. The smaller entity was acting as a relay, boosting the signal of the larger one. They were not just growing. They were building a network. The threat was exponential. If we didn't stop them here, now, they would breach the local water table and spill into the wider system. The sheer scale of the evolution was paralyzing. In 1984, we had fought a lonely, hungry beast. Now, we were facing a colonization. The entities lashed out, sending waves of water crashing toward us. We scrambled back, the freezing liquid soaking our boots. Emma grabbed my arm, steadying me. "We stick to the plan," she yelled, her voice cutting through the fear. David, the drum, Scarlet, the signal. Now! We had walked into a trap of evolution, but we had brought our own evolution to the fight. We weren't just four people with knives anymore. We were a coordinated response. David unslung the spirit drum, his face set in a mask of concentration. Dr. James activated her emitter. Emma and I stood ready to hold the line. The water roared, the lights pulsed, and the battle for the future of the water began. The cavern was filled with chaotic energy that threatened to overwhelm our senses. The two entities towered over churning lake, their glowing forms casting long, frantic shadows against the limestone walls. The psychic pressure was immense, a cacophony of alien thoughts and cold hunger pressing against the walls of our minds. We began the ritual as we had practiced, chanting the words of binding, shouting the commands of containment. But it was immediately clear that our voices were insufficient. The entities were too strong, their connection too established. Our words were like pebbles thrown against a tidal wave, lost in the roar of the water and the hum of their power. The smaller entity darted forward, sending a surge of water that knocked Dr. James's sensor array askew. She scrambled to right it, shouting that the frequency was drifting, that we were losing the lock. Panic began to rise in my chest. The old methods were failing. We needed an anchor, something that could cut through the noise and reach the core of creatures. David Whitefeather stepped forward. He moved with a calm deliberation that seemed to create a bubble of stillness in the chaos. He unzipped the case he carried, and lifted out the spirit drum. It was a beautiful, ancient instrument, its hide skin worn smooth by generations of hands, its frame painted with symbols of the four directions. He did not immediately begin to play. Instead, he pulled a small knife from his belt. He looked at us, his eyes clear and resolute. He understood, as Henry had, that the binding required a sacrifice of self, a physical connection to the ritual. He drew the blade across his palm, a quick, precise movement. But instead of letting the blood drip into water, as we had done in 1984, he pressed his bleeding hand directly onto the center of the drum skin. He held it there for a moment, leaving a dark, stark handprint on the leather. Then he raised a beater and struck the drum. The sound was not loud in terms of decibels, but it was profound in its resonance. Boom! It felt as though the air pressure in the cavern dropped. Boom! The sound traveled to the floor, through our boots and into our bones. It was a heartbeat, deep, primal, and undeniably human. Dr. James looked at her monitor and gasped. "The signal!" she yelled. "It's amplifying. The drumbeat is synchronizing with the biological rhythm of the entities." David found a rhythm, a steady, driving pulse that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the earth itself. Boom, 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 boom. With every strike, the blood on the drum had acted as a conduit, infusing the sound with the essence of life, of intent, of sacrifice. It was a bridge between the physical and the spiritual, amplified by the acoustics of the cavern. Emma, realizing what was happening, stepped up beside David. She cut her own hand and pressed it to the rim of the drum, adding her energy to the instrument. I did the same, placing my hand on the other side. Dr. James, not hesitating for a second, added her own mark. We stood around David, our hands on the drum, our blood connecting us to the instrument and to each other. The sound grew in power. It was no longer just a drum. It was a sonic weapon. The resonance filled the cavern, vibrating at a frequency that directly countered the entity's cohesion. The smaller creature began to shudder. Its form wavered, the water losing its ability to hold the shape. It let out a psychic shriek that was quickly drowned out by the relentless boom-boom of the drum. Suddenly, it shattered, dissolving into a spray of uncontrolled water that splashed harmlessly back into the lake. The massive entity roared in frustration, but it was visibly weakened. The destruction of its offspring had severed a part of its network. It thrashed, trying to retreat, but the sound held it in place. Then David began to speak. He did not use the Ojibwe words Henry had taught us. He spoke in a language I had never heard, sounds that were guttural, rhythmic, and incredibly old. He later told us these were the words of the original binders, a language from a time before tribes, passed down to the deepest oral traditions for exactly this moment. The entity recoiled as it struck physically. The glow began to dim, retreating into the core of the water. The form collapsed, unable to maintain its structure against the sonic and spiritual assault. With a final resonant splash, it dissolved back into the lake. The water churned for a moment longer, then settled. The glow faded to a dull, dying ember deep below, and then vanished. The silence that followed was absolute. The only sound was our ragged breathing and the dripping of water. We stood there, hands still touching the drum, united by the blood and the rhythm. We had won. But as I looked at the dark water, I felt a lingering unease. The victory felt precarious. We had forced it down, yes, but we had also seen its potential. We had seen the network it tried to build. We gathered our gear in silence, the adrenaline fading into exhaustion, and began the long climb back to the surface. The months that followed our expedition into mine were characterized by a strange, suspended sense of normalcy. Spring arrived in the Iron Range with its usual messy enthusiasm, snow melting into slush, rivers swelling with runoff, and the first green shoots pushing through the thawing earth. To the casual observer, life in Tower had returned to its peaceful status quo. The ice on Vermilion Lake broke up and melted away, replaced by the dark, shimmering blue water that drew boaters and fishermen back to its surface. The disappearance of Jessica Hartley was officially categorized as a tragic drowning, a closed case file in a cabinet of sad stories. For us, however, the season offered no real thaw. We had disbanded as a tactical unit, returning to our respective lives. But the connection forged in the dark remained. Dr. Scarlett James returned to her university in Minneapolis, taking her terabytes of data with her. She promised to analyze every spike, every frequency, searching for the key to a permanent solution. Emma threw herself back into her duties as sheriff. But I noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the way she would pause and stare at the lake whenever she drove past it. David Whitefeather retreated into the woods, spending days in meditation, seeking to cleanse his spirit of the heavy energy he had channeled. And I waited. Retirement felt less like a rest and more like a vigil. I spent my days on the porch, watching the water, and my nights wrestling with dreams that were vivid and terrifying. In these dreams, I was not at Vermilion Lake. I was standing on the shores of Lake Superior, looking out at the vast expanse of the inland sea. But the water wasn't blue. It was glowing with that sickly yellow-green light. I saw the Mississippi River winding to the heart of the country, a vein of neon poison. I saw thousands of bodies floating in the currents, not just missing fishermen, but entire populations. The dreams always ended the same way, with the entity's voice echoing in my mind. We will spread. It was a beautiful morning in May 2025 when the illusion of peace shattered. I was in the garden, turning the soil for the spring planting, when the phone rang. It was Dr. James. Her voice, usually so clipped and professional, was trembling. She didn't offer a greeting. She simply said, "Tom, it wasn't an isolated incident." My stomach dropped. I asked her what she meant. She explained that she had been running her algorithms on the data we collected from the mine, the frequency of the hive mind, the specific resonance of the entity's communication. On a hunch, she had requested access to the seismic and hydrological data from monitoring stations across the state. She was looking for matching patterns, faint echoes of the signal we had recorded. "I found them," she whispered. "I found them everywhere." She described a map of Minnesota covered in red dots, small, isolated lakes in the boundary waters, deeper pockets of the Mississippi near St. Cloud, even a retention pond near a suburb in Bloomington. The signal was faint, barely a whisper compared to the scream of Vermilion Lake. But it was there. It was unmistakable. The entity we had fought wasn't a singular monster. It was merely the Alpha, the first awake. The others, dozens, perhaps hundreds of them, were dormant, buried deep in the aquifers, connected by the subterranean waterways that vein the state. "They are waking up," she said, her voice gaining strength. The binding at Vermilion sent a shock wave through the network. It didn't just silence the Alpha, it alerted the others. It was a wake-up call. She predicted the timeline based on the rate of energy increase. The synchronization was accelerating. They weren't going to wake up one by one over decades. They were synchronizing for a mass awakening. She estimated we had until the next peak of the cycle, next February. "It will be an extinction-level event for the state, Tom," she said flatly. "If they all rise at once, they will poison the water table. They will consume everything." I hung up the phone and looked out at the bright spring day. The birds were singing, the sun was shining, and the world looked painfully beautiful. But I knew it was a lie. The false spring was over. The winter was coming back, and this time it would cover everything. I went inside and called Emma. I told her to pack a bag. We were going to Minneapolis. We had a war to plan. The drive from the quiet woods of the Iron Range to the sprawling urban landscape of Minneapolis was a journey between two different worlds. The familiar rhythm of small-town life gave way to the relentless hum of the city, a place of concrete and glass that felt a million miles away from the ancient secrets hidden beneath the earth. Emma drove with a silent, focused intensity, her hands gripping the steering wheel. I watched the scenery change, the pine forest replaced by highways, and felt a profound sense of dislocation. The threat we were facing was not confined to our remote corner of the state. It was flowing silently beneath the feet of millions of people who were completely unaware of the approaching change. We met Dr. Scarlett James in her laboratory at the University of Minnesota. It was a space that buzzed with intellectual energy, a stark contrast to the quiet wisdom of Henry White Feather's cabin. Banks of computers hummed softly, their screens filled with complex graphs and geological maps. Wires snaked across the floor, connecting various pieces of sophisticated monitoring equipment. This was the modern temple of knowledge, and Dr. James was its high priestess. She did not waste time with pleasantries. She guided us to a large, wall-mounted screen that displayed a map of Minnesota. It was covered in dozens of small red dots, each one pulsing with a slow, faint rhythm, like a distant, sleeping heart. She pointed a laser at the cluster of dots in the north. "This is the Iron Range," she said, her voice heavy. "This is where the concentration is highest, where the oldest entities reside. Vermilion Lake was the Alpha, the first awake." She then swept the laser across the rest of the state, illuminating the scattered dots. But it was not the only one. Dr. James explained her discovery with a clarity that made the impossible sound terrifyingly plausible. The aquifers beneath Minnesota were not isolated pools. They were a vast, interconnected circulatory system. The entities were a form of subterranean life that had existed in these waterways for millennia, a superorganism connected by the very water that gave them life. When we had performed the binding at Vermilion Lake, we had not merely silenced the Alpha. We had sent a shockwave through the entire network, a resonant frequency that had acted as a wake-up call to the others. It was an alarm, signaling a change in the environment. The synchronization was the most alarming part of her discovery. The dormant entities were aligning their energy cycles. She showed us graph after graph, each one representing a different location, all showing the same slow, steady crescendo of energy. They were preparing for a mass awakening, based on the exponential rate of energy increase, she stated, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I project a synchronized emergence event in mid-February of next year. That is when the geothermal and lunar cycles will align to create a peak energy window. They will all rise at once." Emma stared at the map, her law enforcement mind trying to process a threat that had no precedent. This wasn't a criminal conspiracy. It was a planetary event. She asked Dr. James about the consequences. The geologist painted a grim picture. If dozens of these entities awakened simultaneously, they would fundamentally alter the water table. The bioelectric energy they consumed would be drawn from every living thing connected to the water, from the forest to the cities. The process would release toxins, making the water unusable. It would be a quiet, systemic collapse, a slow poisoning from within. I looked at the map, at the pulsing red dots, and I understood. The 40-year cycle I had inherited was just a local symptom of a much larger, global rhythm. My grandfather and I had been standing guard over a single door, unaware that the entire house was restless. I saw Emma's expression harden. The weight of her jurisdiction had just expanded from a single county to an entire state. The legacy she had inherited was not just about protecting a town. It was about safeguarding the future of the region. She turned away from the screen and looked at me, then at Dr. James. There was no fear in her eyes, only a cold, hard resolve. She said that this was beyond the scope of a local sheriff's department. It was beyond the scope of a university lab. This required a coordinated response on a scale that was almost unimaginable. But she knew that going public was not an option. The panic and disbelief would be as destructive as the entities themselves. The solution had to be as quiet and as hidden as the threat. She walked over the window and looked out at the city skyline. "If we are facing a network," she said, her voice steady and clear, "then we have to build a network of our own to counter it." She pulled out her phone, her fingers scrolling through a list of contacts. I knew what she was about to do. She was about to make a call that would change everything, a call to bring others into our circle of secrets, to begin the quiet, monumental task of building an army of guardians. Emma's call was not to the governor or to the press. It was to a trusted contact she had cultivated over the years at the FBI's regional office in Minneapolis, a senior agent known for his open mind and his discretion. She framed the situation carefully, avoiding the language of monsters and spirits. She spoke of a credible threat of a cascade biogeological event, citing Dr. James's data on seismic and hydrological anomalies. She presented it as a public safety crisis in the making, one that required a non-traditional, multi-agency response. The agent, trusting Emma's judgment, agreed to a discreet, off-the-record briefing. The first meeting of what would become our secret task force was held in a sterile, windowless conference room in a federal building. The contrast with the warmth of my kitchen table could not have been more pronounced. Around the table sat a small, carefully selected group of individuals. There was the FBI agent, a hydrologist from the state's Department of Natural Resources, a logistics expert from the National Guard, and a quiet woman who served as a liaison to the state's tribal nations. Dr. James presented her findings. She laid out the science, the maps, the energy graphs, and the terrifying timeline. The room was silent, the air thick with tension and disbelief. But as she spoke, the initial skepticism on the faces around the table slowly gave way to a dawning understanding of the threat's magnitude. The hydrologist confirmed the connectivity of the state's aquifers. The logistics expert began to grasp the scale of a statewide operation. The FBI agent recognized the need for absolute secrecy. The plan was born from that meeting. It was audacious in its simplicity and staggering in its complexity. They could not confront the entities directly. Instead, they would counter the network with a network of their own. They would perform a binding ritual amplified by David's spirit drum, but they would do it at every single active site simultaneously. Dr. James's sensors had identified 32 distinct energy signatures, 32 sites. 4 people per site. We needed to recruit, train, and deploy 128 people, all without raising a single alarm. The recruitment process was a delicate dance of trust and intuition. Emma and the tribal liaison reached out to the spiritual leaders of the Ojibwe and Dakota communities across the state. They spoke of the old stories of the earth cycles and found that the knowledge of these entities was not unique to Vermilion Lake. Other communities had their own names for the deep water spirits. The elders understood immediately. David Whitefeather became our lead spiritual trainer, traveling to remote community centers to teach the rhythm of the drum and the ancient words of binding. Meanwhile, Dr. James and her colleagues in academia approached the problem from a different angle. They framed the operation as a large-scale, distributed citizen science project to measure geothermal and magnetic fields during a rare planetary alignment. They recruited graduate students, amateur geologists, and environmentalists, people who were passionate, curious, and comfortable with unusual data. They were trained to use simplified versions of Dr. James's sensors, their task presented as data collection. I found my own role in this new structure. I worked with a network of retired law enforcement officers and first responders, men and women I had known and trusted for decades. I spoke to them not of monsters, but of a civil emergency, a quiet threat that required level-headed individuals who would not panic under pressure. We found hunters, wilderness guides, and retired engineers, people who knew the land and understood the importance of following a plan without question. Over the next several months, we held secret training sessions in hunting lodges, university auditoriums, and community halls in remote corners of the state. It was a remarkable cross-section of Minnesota. Farmers learned to chant ancient words alongside physicists. Teachers learned to read energy signatures. A quiet, determined community was forged in the shared secrecy of our mission. David taught the rhythm of the drums until the sound was a unifying pulse in all our hearts. Dr. James taught the science, giving our mission a logical framework. Emma and I taught the history, the gravity of the legacy they were now a part of. As the winter of 2025 approached, the final pieces of the plan fell into place. The logistics expert from the Guard had arranged for the distribution of the equipment. 32 identical kits, each containing a drum, a censer, and pouches of iron filings and dried sage. The teams were assigned. The coordinates were distributed. By the second week of February, everyone was in position, waiting for the signal. The night before the operation, we held a final briefing over a secure video conference. 128 faces looked back at us from their small screens, their expressions a mixture of hope and profound tension. They were an army of ordinary people who had accepted an extraordinary responsibility. As I looked at the determined faces, I felt a powerful sense of hope. The world had changed, and so had we. We were no longer facing the darkness alone. We were a network of light, ready to push back the tide. February 14th, 2025. The day dawned cold and brilliantly clear. The sky was an impossible blue, the sun hanging like a polished coin in the heavens, offering light but no warmth. It was minus 35 degrees across most of Minnesota, a deep, pervasive freeze that felt like the earth itself holding its breath. For most people, it was just another bitter winter day, a reason to stay indoors with a hot drink. But for the 128 people scattered across 32 locations, it was a culmination of months of secret preparation. I stood on the frozen surface of Vermilion Lake, the wind whipping around my parka. This was ground zero, the place where it had all begun. Around me stood my team, Sheriff Emma Morrison, Dr. Scarlett James, and Officer David Whitefeather. We were positioned precisely as Henry had taught us 40 years ago, north, south, east, and west, forming a human compass around the central point of the lake. But this time we were not alone. Connected via secure military-grade communication channels, 31 other teams were taking their positions on frozen lakes, beside icy rivers, and in snowy clearings across the state. We were a constellation of guardians, a human web stretched tight over the sleeping land. At exactly 11:55 a.m., Dr. James checked her sensor array. The readings were spiking. The energy beneath the ice was rising in a synchronized crescendo, a silent roar of awakening that only her machines could hear. She gave the signal. Across the state, radios crackled to life. All teams, stand by. Emma's voice, calm and authoritative, echoed in earpieces from the boundary waters to the Mississippi bluffs. Initiate sequence in 3, 2, 1. At noon precisely, the drums began. It started here, with David striking the first blow on his spirit drum. Boom! The sound rolled across the ice, a deep, resonant heartbeat. A fraction of a second later, 31 other drums answered. Though separated by hundreds of miles, they were striking in perfect unison, guided by a synchronized digital clock. Boom! The sound was not just heard, it was felt. It traveled to frozen ground, vibrating in the bedrock, creating a standing wave of sonic energy that spanned the entire state. We began to chant. The ancient words, the language of the original binders, rose from our throats into the cold air. But this time, it was a chorus of over 100 voices, a harmonic convergence of intent. I closed my eyes and let the rhythm take me. In my mind's eye, I saw the map of Minnesota. I saw each team as a point of light, a beacon burning in the winter dark. And as the drums beat on, I saw lines of light connecting them, threads of energy weaving together, forming a net of brilliance that overlay the dark, pulsing veins of subterranean water. The reaction from beneath the ice was immediate. The lake groaned, a deep, tectonic sound that made the ice beneath our boots shudder. But it wasn't the violent thrashing of 1984. It was different. The entities were rising, yes, screaming their silent psychic scream, a wave of cold hunger that washed over us. But as they rose, they hit the net. The web of sound and spirit we had woven held firm. The resonance created by the synchronized drums acted as a dampener, a sonic cage that wrapped around the emerging energy and smothered it. I felt a sudden, profound shift in atmosphere. It was a sensation of immense pressure being released, like a fever breaking. The screaming in my head stopped abruptly. The groaning of the ice ceased. The wind seemed to die down. For a moment, there was absolute silence, a stillness so perfect it felt holy. And then I saw it. It wasn't something visible to the naked eye, but a vision shared by everyone in the circle. A pulse of pure, white light traveled to the network, connecting every site, every drummer, every guardian. It was a flash of unity, a moment where humanity and the earth were perfectly aligned. The entities were forced back, not destroyed, not defeated in battle, but simply compelled by a stronger will to return to their slumber. The energy spikes on Dr. James's monitor flatlined instantly. The threat had been neutralized. We stood there for a long time, the echoes of the drums fading into the vast winter silence. We were freezing, exhausted, and trembling, but we were alive. And more importantly, the water beneath us was quiet. The web had held. The relief that followed the success of the operation was profound, a collective exhale after months of holding our breath. The teams disbanded quietly, melting back into their everyday lives like snow in spring. The equipment was packed away, the data secured, and the secret remained kept. Life in Minnesota continued its march toward the thaw, oblivious of the fact that it stood on the precipice of an ecological catastrophe. For a few months, we allowed ourselves to believe it was over. We believed we had won the war, or at least secured a lasting peace. But the universe, as my grandfather often reminded me, rarely offers such simple endings. 6 months later, in the humid heat of August 2025, Dr. Scarlett James called an emergency meeting. We gathered again in her lab in Minneapolis. Emma, David, myself, and the core members of the task force. The mood was somber. Dr. James looked tired, her face lined with new, deeper worry. She pulled up a map on the main screen, but it wasn't a map of Minnesota we had become so familiar with. It was a map of North America. The network worked, she began, her voice steady but lacking its usual triumph. We successfully bound the entities in Minnesota. The energy signatures here are dormant, flatline. She pointed to our state, now a quiet zone on the map. But in doing so, we created a localized vacuum in the bioelectric field. She zoomed out, showing the region surrounding Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ontario, Manitoba. Nature abhors a vacuum. When we silenced our local network, the sudden drop in energy didn't just put our entities to sleep. It sent a signal outward, far beyond our state lines. She tapped the screen, and new data points appeared. Red dots pulsing in the lakes of Wisconsin along the shores of the Great Lakes, deep in the Canadian Shield. The entities aren't just a statewide phenomenon, she said softly. They are continental, perhaps even global. And by binding our local cluster, we didn't end the threat. We just shifted the frequency. We alerted the rest of the hive. She showed us the new data. Faint but unmistakable signals were coming from the massive bodies of water that define the geography of North America. Lake Superior, Lake Huron, the vast river systems of the interior. The network we had fought was just a single node in a much larger, ancient ecosystem. And now, the rest of the organism was waking up to investigate the silence. The room was silent. The scale of the revelation was paralyzing. We had trained 128 people. To cover this new map, we would need thousands. We would need a coordinated effort across international borders, involving governments and agencies that would never believe our story without proof we couldn't provide. Emma stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city. She didn't look defeated. She looked resigned but resolved. "So," she said, turning back to us, "the job just got bigger." Just then, her phone buzzed on the table. She picked it up and looked at the screen. Her eyebrows shot up. "It's a call from Colorado," she said, "from United States Northern Command." We stared at her. The military, someone, somewhere had noticed a massive, synchronized energy event in February. They had seen the data. They knew something had happened, even if they didn't understand what. And they were reaching out to the sheriff of St. Louis County. Emma answered the phone. "This is Sheriff Morrison," she said, her voice calm, professional. She listened for a long time, her eyes meeting mine. "Yes," she said finally. "We need to talk. I think you have a water problem." She hung up the phone. "They're sending a plane," she told us. "We're going to Peterson Space Force Base. It seems the war of the water is just beginning." I sat back in my chair, looking at the faces of my team, my daughter, the scientist, the spiritual warrior. We had started as 4 people on a frozen lake. Now, we were about to step onto a much larger stage. I thought of my grandfather, Jonas, writing his lonely notes by candlelight. I thought of Henry, keeping the old stories alive in his cabin. They had held the line in the dark, so we could stand in the light. The fight was eternal. The vigilance required was endless. But as I looked at the map of the continent, glowing with the challenge of the future, I felt a strange sense of peace. We were ready. We had the knowledge, we had the team, and now we had allies. The watch continues.